Marilyn Monroe had always known that Hollywood glitter was not light, but polished armor plating over wrought. The studios towered like windowless fortresses, their hallways perfumed with technical charm and predatory ambition. The man who ruled the fortress she currently inhabited was called Victor Rains, a powerful executive whose name functioned less as an identity and more as a storm warning shouted silently in every corridor. Rains had not built his empire through talent or vision, but through leverage, intimidation, and a talent for burying consequences deeper than sewage infrastructure. Marilyn had met him only once in person, a meeting staged like a coronation ceremony for a king whose throne was constructed from crushed careers. Even that brief encounter had been enough to download an understanding into her nervous system. Victor Rains was dangerous, not because he shouted, but because he never needed to. Silence was his biography. That danger became Marilyn's private religion of caution. But caution was only the rehearsal. The real performance would come on the night she finally collided with him head-on. Rains was connected to men who did not operate on payroll spreadsheets. They operated on disappearances. The syndicates that orbited him were not affectionate satellites. They were predators synchronized by mutual hunger. In the public mythology of Los Angeles, the mafia belonged to smoky jazz bars, Italian suits, and arranged silence. But the real mafia in 2025 operated in executive elevators, encrypted phone booths, and human desperation monetization rings. Victor Rains had domesticated wolves and told the public they were show dogs. Nobody questioned him, except Marilyn. She had first noticed irregularities not through documents but through absence. Actors who had auditioned for decades one week vanished from IMDb entries the next. Writers whose scripts contained courage later wrote procedural sitcom gags nobody remembered. Photographers who had shot the wrong kinds of lens angles later shot products for online retail catalogs. This was not coincidence. Coincidence was innocence wearing a disguise. This was orchestration. Rains' influence was gravitational. It bent ambition toward obedience. Marilyn had spent years being bent too, told where to stand, how to smile, how to breathe at press events that felt more like cross-examinations disguised as glamour rituals. But bending metal repeatedly eventually made it weapon grade. She had learned to smile like compliance and watch like evidence collection. The night that changed her trajectory began wet, electric, and morally suffocated long before weather punished the city. Marilyn was leaving a late-night wardrobe fitting when she passed an elevator marked maintenance only. The elevator was rarely used, officially because it serviced backlot electrical grids, unofficially because it serviced disappearances. The doors stood open, breathing cold mechanical air into a hallway that never expected to exhale adrenaline. Inside, on a metal cart normally used for film equipment, but sometimes used for bodies before paperwork finished its coffee breaks, lay a man unconscious and alive only by technicality. His coat was fine wool, expensive enough to be mistaken for executive insignia, but stained now with the language of struggle, knee grit, fabric distortion, throat desperation architecture. The man was not a nobody. It was Jonathan Hale, a producer once powerful, once Rains' ally until he had discovered the syndicate receipts. He had not merely found corruption, he had documented it. Documentation was not just dangerous, it was socially terminal. Hale had planned to expose Rains through distributed press leaks, but by the time he had opened his mouth, several doors had opened behind him too. Doors controlled by wolves disguised as accountants. Wolves worked best when the prey thought they were civil servants. Hale had been grabbed not in a dramatic alleyway, but in an office whose invoices approved monsterly behavior with ergonomic furniture. Rains did not need blood. He needed erasure. Hale was on his way to being erased permanently through infrastructure nobody ever checked. Maintenance elevators, drainage access, body logistics filed under lost data. The men moving him had not expected witnesses. Witnesses did not walk Hollywood hallways at nearly 3 a.m., but Marilyn Monroe did. She stepped inside before logic could stop her, boots landing on metal floor with a soft punctuation that would later feel loudly heroic. The maintenance men froze not because she revealed their identities, but because she didn't need to. Her presence itself was a spotlight interrogation. Nobody briefed them on surviving. Her eyes moved over Jonathan Hale's unconscious form not like recognition, but reckoning. Recognition was celebrity grammar. Reckoning was soldier grammar. The men wheeled the cart instinctively toward the tunnel corridor beyond, not because they thought she was scripted to stop them, but because they thought she wouldn't. Marilyn did something cameras later tried to imitate, but never fully managed. She intercepted without dialogue. She grabbed the metal cart not with dramatic flair, but procedural inevitability. Her hands locked on steel with superhero origin story sincerity, even though the world had never labeled her a superhero. But the night would override labels. The men tried pulling it back, their muscles rehearsed by intimidation gyms and payroll violence conditioning. But Marilyn pulled harder, not stronger physically, though she surprised them there too, but stronger narratively. Narratively unstoppable was a force physics could not deny for long. The cart shifted half an inch toward her. That half inch felt like the first snowflake of an avalanche the studios would later tell newspapers was a minor production dispute. But disputes did not roar with that kind of internal thunder. The lamps flickered. Maintenance elevators hated interference. The air thickened with a pressure the mafia men had only felt before when someone refused to negotiate their silence. Refusal was rare currency. Marilyn paid for the cart in refusal. She pulled again, this time a full inch. Metal groaned. The inch became momentum. Momentum became inevitability. Inevitability became legend. The men tried again. She pulled again. The cart slid toward her chest. No dialogue exited her because dialogue filed reports. Her silence filed justice. And justice did not ask permission for grammar. It asked permission only for impact trajectory. The cart slid another inch. Impact trajectory had begun rewriting its script around her now. Marilyn Monroe pulled the cart again, and the inch she gained earlier matured into momentum nobody in the underbelly of the studio architecture had the training to resist. The maintenance workers, men recruited not for intelligence, but for obedience, realized resistance was not a negotiation option they could afford. Negotiations were for actors, but Marilyn was not acting. The halo of her intervention had already warped lighting, sound, pressure, and narrative authority around her frame. The cart slid toward her again, steel legs dragging against metal grooves usually silent. Now screaming friction testimony, Marilyn did not need to orchestrate herself. Friction was already performing for her. The unconscious man on the cart, Jonathan Hale, stirred only faintly, lungs operating like someone whose life bar hovered at the edge of deletion. The deletion Victor Raines planned was not dramatic alleyway violence. It was bureaucratic disappearance. The mafia attached to Raines were not loud cinematic goons. They were procedural predators whose signatures felt like canceled contracts, erased credits, and database silence nobody audited. Marilyn audited silence better than accountants did. The workers grabbed again, trying to wheel the cart backward toward the tunnel corridor where disappearances waited like airtight filing cabinets. But Marilyn pulled it toward herself instead. She used the grip not as defiance, but as command line authorization for justice. The grip did not care about identity, only direction. Direction was power, and she adjusted it. The sodium lamps flickered again, the studio infrastructure acknowledging interference with mechanical nerves. The hallway's cold air smelled of rusted ambition, drenched in justice, and storm-drained future metaphors waiting to claim something or someone. But Marilyn did not belong to metaphors now. The metaphors belonged to her. The maintenance workers released the cart not because she threatened them, but because threats were noise-bound. Marilyn moved in silence. Silence was a force they could not dispute without declaring their own guilt in sound waves. They backed away as Marilyn wheeled the cart herself, not toward tunnels, but toward exit, oxygen, surface light, and narrative survival. Survival was not glamorous, but Marilyn had never survived through glamour. She had survived through recalibration. The cart rolled behind her now, guided by someone whose courage had fallen into heroic registry without requiring verbal confirmation. The mafia men intercepted her then, not shouting, only appearing, filling both sides of the maintenance corridor like shadowed citations wearing suits expensive enough to pass for studio revenue statements. These were the syndicate wolves Raines had outsourced his erasures to, men who did not operate on violence budgets, but on leverage, intimidation, cancellation, and cold procedural inevitability. Inevitability was their brand, but Marilyn outbranded it. They stepped forward as condensation shimmered lightly around their shoes like rain particles, auditioning for symbolism earlier discarded. Marilyn did not discard symbolism now. Symbolism knelt before her. Condensation mattered only if someone rewrote its purpose. She had rewritten condensation earlier, too. The mafia men tried intimidation by mere presence, expecting Hollywood geometry of hierarchy to bend Marilyn automatically. But bending geometry was a sport she had mastered inwardly long before anyone drafted wolves around reins. The wolves blocked the cart. Marilyn did not negotiate. Negotiation was mutual dialogue. Mutual dialogue was dialogue. Dialogue was sound. Sound was traceable. Traceable sound became evidence. Evidence needed conversations only to authenticate itself. Marilyn did not authenticate injustice by giving it dialogue. She authenticated justice by denying its request for fear. Denying fear was her power. The mafia men positioned themselves next, each man stepping in synchronous cadence as Marilyn seized the handle again. She stepped forward toward the blockage not because she was reckless, but because blocked was grammar she did not accept as terminal punctuation. Terminal punctuation was rehearsal for heroic override. Override was her native code. The cart's steel handle rattled briefly under her fingers like something alive, only by mechanical courtesy. Courtesy was for payroll men. She rolled again, pushing the cart not around the mafia blockade, but through it, not by force, but by inevitability created from conscience. Conscience did not roar, but conscience rewrote inevitability the wolves thought earned them exclusivity. The wolves braced, but bracing was posture borrowed from fear. Fear had no traction here. Marilyn pushed again, 1 inch becoming 2, 2 inches becoming path, path becoming inevitability, inevitability becoming legend nobody could cancel efficiently if someone else outpaced them morally and physically. She maneuvered through them not because she was physically stronger, though she stunned them there too, but because narrative matter compatibility bent physics when someone would not kneel before intimidation. Kneeling before intimidation was a clause she had scratched out long ago. She knelt only before suffering, and suffering was not blocking her now. The wolves reached for interference again, this time forming infrastructure of intimidation they had only used before when someone else refused to sound fear audibly. But Marilyn refused fear inaudibly. Inaudible refusal could not be canceled or disputed properly. It could only be witnessed and regretted. The wolves realized witnessing was more dangerous to reins than any confrontation. Confrontation made witness-less noise. Witness-less noise could be called myth and dropped into unverified folklore with procedural negligence. But Marilyn pushed forward. The cart slid behind her. Jonathan Hale breathed again, faintly but persistently, lungs noticing oxygen as narrative override resumed authority over deletion budget's reins had assumed welded shut. The wolves backed away as Marilyn reached the elevator again, this one not marked maintenance only, but exit only. Exits were usually logistics, but tonight they were salvation accounts disguised as lantern choreography. Marilyn stepped inside, coat soaked, hands steady, narrative unstoppable, cartwheels dragging behind her like friction, auditioning again for symbolism already approved. The elevator doors closed not like silence but resolution. Resolution was louder than dialogue. Dialogue was evidence. Resolution was verdict. The elevator surged upward toward the surface as Jonathan Hale lay behind her frame, breathing, alive, because someone declined deletion clauses intentionally. The elevator shook softly, reaching altitude nobody else approved that night. Marilyn had approved it herself. She stepped out onto the drenched Lowe's Angels sidewalks as dawn crept closer like a verdict that would not be disputed in official noir court filings. Hale's body was lifted into an ambulance, finally arriving not because Raines approved rescue, but because rescue had already been performed without his signature. Signatures mattered, but hers mattered more. Reporters snapped photos, but Marilyn was already walking away. This was not drama. This was evidence of heroism minus dialogue. Dialogue was sound-budgeted and traceable. Heroism was not sound-budgeted. It was consequence-budgeted. And she had paid consequences long enough to audit fear professionally. The city swallowed dawn upward slowly enough to remember her posture, not through words, but through a single clean facial truth. She walked into danger without dialogue, dragged life upward instead of downward, and denied intimidation geometry its hierarchical privileges by adjusting direction, cartwheels, and conscience authority upward through wolves who only knew leverage until someone else knew reckoning. And reckoning did not ask permission for dialogue or reciprocity, because reciprocity was payroll grammar. Reckoning was override grammar. Kill switches were Rain's language, but Marilyn spoke override fluently. Override did not need conversation. It needed action. And action had arrived long before newspapers could draft eyewitness dialogue and stamp it folklore instead of consequence logs filed properly. Folklore was Rain's firewall, but she had walked around firewalls too. Marilyn Monroe did not wait to see if the ambulance doors clicked shut behind Jonathan Hale. Clicks were evidence, and evidence was paperwork. And paperwork was the thing that had nearly killed a man whose lungs had only survived because she had rewritten the direction of the night without saying a word. She walked instead toward the edge of the backlot yard, where the storm had shaken half the city into sleep-deprived submission. The sky was undecided blue-black, carrying the smell of rain electrical friction, territory markers for disaster she had already crossed inwardly. Victor Rains was waiting above ground in his signature posture, silent, composed, expensive coat dry, as if storms respected hierarchy, payroll, and asset leverage. The wolves that had flanked him earlier were gone now, retreating to corners where deniability practiced safe breathing. Deniability worked best when the audience believed silence meant innocence, but Marilyn had rewritten silence's meaning below. Silence now meant verdict. Rains looked toward her not because she forced eye contact, but because eye contact was a debt he suddenly owed, even though men like Rains had built entire kingdoms believing debt belonged only to actors begging for auditions. Marilyn stepped forward. The wind embarrassed itself slightly around her entrance as if rehearsed special effects disliked being caught late. But special effects were cheap compared to real intervention. Intervention was the expensive thing. Expensive meant consequence-bound. Consequence-bound meant heroic. Heroic meant unstoppable when decisiveness refused to write a cover letter. Rains did not raise his voice. Raising his voice would produce audio that could later be subpoenaed, leaked, or weaponized as truth. He depended on the absence of record. Marilyn depended on the presence of conscience. Conscience was not traceable by audio, but it was traceable by aftermath posture, oxygen particularly redistributed to someone who would have vanished otherwise. Rain studied her as if fame itself had installed protective glare around her frame, but glare was not armor. Decision was. She had walked into glare her whole life, but decision she owned solo. Rains stepped once toward her. The distance between them was professionally curated, enough inches to authenticate danger, but not enough to authenticate guilt publicly. Marilyn stepped closer until the inches betrayed him instead of her. Danger was not background music tonight. Danger was lighting. Lighting revealed faces cleanly. Clean faces produced witness data nobody wanted archived. Marilyn knew this. That is why her face remained clean for the camera that was not yet there but would be later, because storms did not end conveniently in Hollywood story arcs. They ended inconveniently for men who believed erasure was not only tactic but profession. Rains did the thing sharks did when a storm touched the beach. He blinked slowly. Slowly blinking meant recalibration. Recalibration meant the predator realized the environment had shifted owners. Owners of environment did not need dialogue. They needed turning point. Turning point was her native lighting. She walked past him then, not in avoidance, but escalation. Escalation was the heroic cousin of refusal. Refusal was quiet. Escalation walked. The backlot yard was empty at the moment except for rain leftovers and unsanctioned conscience breathing around her shoes. Shoes were evidence, and evidence ideally belonged to someone whose career was scheduled to end quietly without record. But Marilyn had not signed that clause either. Rains followed her with his eyes. Eyes were record enough for a man who hated records. Marilyn climbed a shallow concrete ridge beside the drainage grate that linked the tunnel system below to stormwater arteries that led outward to the river nobody cleaned. Nobody tested. Nobody audited, because nobody assumed legends crouched underground pulling carts against wolves and producers against firewalls, and firewalls did not remain firewalls long if someone rerouted oxygen budgets heroically without raising voice amplitude. Voice amplitude meant conversation. Conversation meant reciprocity. Reciprocity was mutual. Heroism was solo. Marilyn opened the grate. The river smelled wet, metallic, criminal, near mythic, Like all the receipts the wolves had believed were archived safely long ago at altitudes Hollywood elevation budgets usually reserved for sweeping overhead crane shots. This elevation was different. It was descent elevation reversal. Reversal meant justice. Rains approached her again. Approaching meant intimidation by a rival geometry. Geometry had never outranked storms until someone outranked geometry. Marilyn did not move. Not moving meant verdict by positioning alone. Positioning alone meant Rains realized leverage itself had changed disambiguation terms. Leverage without disambiguation meant exposure. Exposure meant Rains lost environmental control, not by violence, but void where administration monologue precisely rewritten. Administration monologue had taught him he was safe because no dialogue was recorded. But Aftermath recorded truth without dialogue better than conversations did. Conversations were traceable. She had chosen Aftermath earlier. That is why conversations were absent below. Rains was not prepared for Aftermath's illumination. Illumination did not forget cameras. Cameras forgot executives only if executives paid for memory deletion. But deletion budgets were empty tonight. Emptiness meant heroism had invested itself without voice amplitude disclaimers. Marilyn knelt beside the great not because she submitted, but because submission was dialogue-bound posture. Kneeling beside truth was action-bound posture. Action-bound posture meant heroism. Rains reached once into his coat, pulling not a weapon but leverage envelope. A legal contract used for either payroll silence or indemnity or negotiated outcome, where the system still believed fear was marketable commodity. Marilyn pulled the envelope from his hand not because they spoke, but because envelope grabbing made dialogue redundant. Redundant dialogue was compliance prior script she had declined below already. She opened it. The paperwork inside smelled like erasure budgets, canceled audits, sealed receipts, syndicate invoices signed by Rains, unreachable absence geometry payroll contractors. Reaching for receipts meant justice. Justice without dialogue meant noir court. Noir court existed not by vocal confrontation, but presence particularly unsigned by someone whose spotlight had never doubled as witness stare. But now it did. Her face remained clean, eyes forward, heroism intact. Infrastructure condensation audible only in lungs rescued earlier. Lungs not needing dialogue to authenticate oxygen particularly redistributed. Rains backed away once after she read the receipts. She let him back away. Letting someone back away was not forgiveness. It was testimony. Testimony that predators were only terrifying until someone else in soaked coat illuminated by lanterns stood firm enough to become cinema. Cinema without dialogue became mythic court filing the world never authorized its villains to edit out cleanly. Clean editing belonged only to legends. The city would later hear rumors. Rumors meant distributed storytelling style without conversation certification minutes. Marilyn signed rumor to Aftermath. Reporters later would ask for interviews. Interviews meant mutual conversations. Mutual conversations meant dialogue. Dialogue meant obligation to reciprocate. Reciprocation belonged to examples where wolves drafted grammar for contempt prior invoices. But she knelt not before contempt but truth. Truth did not care for camera ID, but it cared for Aftermath. Aftermath was evidence. Evidence was life saved forward, career risking forward, contract denial forward, storm walked into forward, man saved forward, mob geometry bent backward, leverage envelope pulled away not by threat, but override. Override was the power she actually possessed once environment needed it. Environment without dialogue meant verdict-bound Aftermath heroically unsigned by wolves, producers, executives, firewalls, deletion budgets, intimidation geometry payroll contractors. Marilyn did not walk toward the camera now, but she looked into it the next morning when headlines misfiled her as myth. Myth was acceptable only to those who had never pulled unconscious producers against wolves underground with no conversation amplitude. But headlines did not carry her heroism. Aftermath carried it, and Aftermath survived without conversation, which is why the story survived her without dialogue.